Welcome to Clubhouse.
Thanks.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to join and get settled in. Very excited to have Mr. Green on stage with us to talk about his book. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome to our room, Love, Lust, and Murder in Queer New York with author Elon Green. Want to welcome Elon to the stage.
Thanks
Uh,
for having me.
thanks for writing this book. Just a little bit about you. You've
But by
written.
the way, just
Mhm.
just the full title is Last Call: Love, Lust, and Murder in Queer New York.
Yes, Last Call: A True Story of Love, Lust, and Murder in Queer New York. And for those of you who have not yet read the book, I'll just give you a little summary of it. Um, it is about the long forgotten early 1990s murders of men picked up in Manhattan gay bars and the resulting police investigations. It's also about the lives of the victims and the city's queer social scene and nightlife at the height of the AIDS epidemic. Last Call was chosen by NPR as a 2021 Book of the Year and is a finalist for an Edgar Award and an Audie Award. So, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Um, Mr. Green has written for the New York Times Magazine, The Owl, and New York. He is anthologized in Unspeakable Acts. I will say that I was really shocked that there wasn't a Wikipedia for this, and I actually did a search, and I still don't see a Wikipedia for the Last Call Killer.
Yeah, it's kind of annoying.
Yes, there's a Murderpedia, but there's no Wikipedia.
Yeah, if somebody here wants to take care of that, I would be appreciative.
Yeah, so if anyone in the audience is one of those Wikipedia authors, if you do that for, especially for true crime cases, feel free to do that because I think everyone this should be on Wikipedia. And for those of you in the audience, please share the room and ping people in if you think they would be interested. I think everyone should be interested in this case. So, my first question is why did you write this book? And I'm sure you've been asked this a million times, but that's always my first question to authors. Why this book?
Um, because once I got past the original, uh, surprise at the case, the sort of the broad strokes of the murders and the investigations, I just got really fascinated by the lives of the victims, and that's what drew me in for the long term. And I was also shocked that it wasn't not only I was first of all shocked that I hadn't heard of it, just because although I'm not obsessed with true crime or serial killers, I do live in New York and I do have some sort of interest in it, especially that period. And it seemed impossible to me that something could have been happening, in the period in New York right before Sex in the City, and people just had either not noticed or forgotten about it. And so, part of what I set out to do was also just to figure out why nobody remembered it. And once I got going, all I wanted to do was learn more.
Well, thank you for writing this book. I've heard other interviews with you, and people seem very shocked that a serial killer could go unnoticed. And do you think, like one of the quotes from your book, which I think we could definitely have a discussion about, you said Duncan Osborne. The quote is, um, in order for someone's murder to get attention, you had to be straight, white, and murdered in Central Park.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a period where I think it's either 1990 or 1991, where there were something like 2,245 homicides in New York City, and I think that's the peak. Um, I'm guessing that it's probably like 10% of that now. I mean, you know, this was a period where, even though obviously there were far more newspapers, far more reporters working in the city, like there wasn't even enough manpower to write about all the homicides that were going on. Um, but but yeah, absolutely. Like there were always editorial decisions made about whose murders to cover, and definitely, you know, gender, sexuality, geography. It as it does today, it all played a role. And Duncan Osborne was and is one of the great gay investigative reporters in the country, and he knows better than anybody, what doesn't get covered.
Exactly. So before we proceed, I do want to read the names of the victims, and just maybe a sentence about them. Um, so, so there was Peter S. Anderson, and he was in Manhattan from Philadelphia to attend a political fundraiser. There was also Thomas Mulcahy, who was also in New York for business, and Anthony Marrero, a sex worker who worked around Midtown Manhattan, and Michael Sakara, who was a gay man who worked as a typesetter for the New York Law Journal. And I also want to mention Fred Spencer, because this was Richard Rogers' I think first victim. This was his roommate when he was in college.
Yep.
But when I looked up his victim, like it's not like his name doesn't always pop up. Can you say a little bit more about that case?
Well, Fred's killing, you know, was literally relegated to a sidebar. Um, whenever it was mentioned after Richard was caught, and that the chapter on him, he was killed in 1973. He was basically beaten to death with a roofing hammer, and you know that was that. Reporters totally missed the boat on that. There was very little to work with. There was no court transcript, um, and I ended up having to find his still surviving housemate, and just talking to everybody you could find who knew him, who had gone to school with him, his high school girlfriend, because I felt like in a case where the victims were not prioritized, the last thing I wanted to do was skimp on the life of, arguably the most crucial victim in the case. And by crucial, I mean, if it were not for that first killing, Richard would never have been caught.
Agreed. I have a lot of thoughts on that. The fact that there were no defensive wounds, um, that was huge. Like, how do you overlook someone saying they beat someone with a hammer because they, I guess in fear of their life, but there's no defensive wounds on them?
Yeah, I mean, this is the early 70s. The gay panic defense is pretty rampant at that point. Now, you know, to be fair, I don't know for sure if that's what was part of the defense, but it also didn't really have to be at that point. There was basically an understanding uh, around, Bangor and Orono, Maine, that there was a quote gay angle to the case, and without having talked to jurors in the case because their names are not public, um, I can tell you that it was most likely viewed as one gay man killing another. And in 1973 in Maine, that was not a big deal. That was not viewed as a big deal, rather.
Yeah, and you mentioned how his family kind of were just so in shock. They were kind of hands off with the investigation. Um, I don't know if you have any more to say about that. It seemed like they just, I mean, was it just the shock in the morning of it happening?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely not indicative of their closeness to him. They they you know lived in New York State. They didn't live. They weren't living near Maine, uh, this just shattered the family and has to this day. Uh, so they just, I don't think that mentally, emotionally, they were really capable of being as involved as, say, Tom Mulcahy's wife was.
Yeah. Do you know? I mean, in addition to the murder, the verdict, do you know anything about how they? I mean, I'm sure that made it worse that he basically got away with murder.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't. I think sort of the notion of closure is kind of bullshit anyway. But I don't know that any verdict would have healed those wounds. Just because Fred was so young, he was brilliant. Uh, he was just snuffed out, and didn't even manage to get out of his 20s. So uh, I think that there was probably no result that would have been much of a comfort to the family. That's my guess.
Yeah. I mean, in such a brutal fashion too.
Right.
It's just a lot. Speaking of the killer Richard Rogers past, you do mention the murder, and I don't have his name off the but John Perro, Matthew John Perro. You did mention him. For some clarification, were you suggesting that maybe he could have also been a victim of Richard Rogers?
Yes, yeah, that's why I wrote about him. Matthew John Piero. He was from New Jersey. He was murdered in, if memory serves, I think it was Orlando or Daytona. Um, and detectives are quite certain that Richard did it, but you know, that case will probably forever remain officially open and unsolved. But yes, the only reason I wrote about it is because I think he did it, and it was to suggest that there are probably a lot of other ones, a lot of other cases that are classified as missing persons, but are probably not.
Absolutely. Um, Another thought I had was just in general, like that wasn't even his very first victim. I think that made that we think that's his first victim, but the woman that he assaulted when he
Well,
was.
no, I mean the first victim is probably Fred Spencer in
Mhm.
'73.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah,
But the woman he assaulted when he was a kid, did he like stab her and he got away with it? And I think in the book you said that people were stunned that he basically got away with physically assaulting someone.
yeah, I mean, and the details on this are extremely hazy and haven't been confirmed one way or the other. But people who had gone to high school with him, definitely remember talk of him having stabbed a woman in the neighborhood and having been possibly institutionalized. Um, and assuming that that actually happened, that was probably the first known incident of violence in his life.
Wow, just like maybe trying it out. I don't know what his what that was about,
I
but
mean, I'm extremely leery of engaging in, like forensic psychology and trying to psychologize his thought process or motivations or anything like that, because uh, I think so much of that is nonsense, and I don't want to get over my skis with that. I mean, there's just so many unknowns with him because he never talked, and of course, even if he had, uh, is he really to be believed? Um, but I mean, this probably gets to my larger thoughts about how much you know any of that really matters when it comes to serial killers. I do think that there are incidences, of when there's a single instance of murder, sure, I think motive factors into it, love, money, whatever. But when it comes to serial killers, I tend to believe that they're doing this because they enjoy it. And
Mm.
to me, that's not a particularly interesting motivation. And I don't know really why people harp on it so much. Like, I mean, one of the things I often wonder is like, okay, what is this motive that you're hoping for?
Mm.
You know?
Mhm. Yeah. I just think with that case, with that situation, like there were so many missed opportunities for people to recognize the kind of man he was and what he was capable of. Um,
Oh yeah. I mean, and I definitely think that this is a systemic thing. The history of serial killer investigations is inevitably a history of, missed opportunities and poor law enforcement, and whether you're talking about the famous ones like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer, there's these again and again instances where, or the Zodiac, where, of course, he was famously identified as a black man. And so the San Francisco Police Department walked right past him. I mean, you have just these terrible decisions that enable people to get away with it again and again.
Absolutely. And then was it? I'm trying to forget the gentleman who escaped with his life. The
Um,
gentleman.
so
Yeah.
you're talking about the case in 1988. In the book, I call him Sandy Harrow, who was a priest turned investment who had gone home to 1988 and had basically been uh, injected, with one or more medications. He'd passed out, and when he woke up, he was restrained in hospital bracelets.
It was the slut shaming for me. Like I couldn't even I mean, it definitely happens today. But it was, whatever the equivalent is, which I think is the same, regardless if it's a man or a woman, or if it's, LGBTQ. It doesn't matter. It's like basically the way that the attorney for Richard Rogers was basically able to shame him for, you know,
Yeah,
basically.
and of course, to me, it wasn't so much, you know, it just, I don't know that it was so much surprising the sentiment, but so much of what the trial ended up being about was the subtext was really about the AIDS epidemic, and you know, at one point the lawyer, sort of suggests that the plaintiff, um, would bring strange men home all the time, and he says to the lawyer, um, sir, this is the age of AIDS. I do no such thing. Um, and so yeah, there's like a certain amount of slut shaming, but it also has the added through line of basically shaming gay men for having AIDS.
Yeah. And having sex with men, and also just making him sound crazy and paranoid, quote unquote. That was part of the defense.
Right, right.
It sounded like because of a 30-minute discrepancy, they wanted to believe that it wasn't possible. It was just, yeah, that was a hard thing to listen to for me. And I listened to the audiobook because maybe if they had recognized again the kind of person he was, he basically showed how he did things, and yeah, they missed the mark on that.
Yeah, I mean, and that was a bench trial, so it took place over a few days. He really didn't miss any work, and of course, because it was a bench trial and because it was an acquittal, um, no one knew about it, you know. So Mount Sinai Hospital never even knew that he'd been on trial for it.
Yeah, and then he also thanked the jury. I noticed he thanks the jury in like all his cases when he gets let off. Like, you made the right decision. It's
Yeah,
very
pretty
interesting.
right.
Well, speaking of Richard Rogers, I had some thoughts in terms of just the way he was described as a serial killer who was squeamish about blood and a neat freak.
Yeah.
I found that really interesting because that kind of played into this idea that he couldn't have done it or was meek and mild.
Yeah, I mean, there's always contradictory things about people, and you know, like I interviewed a surgeon who, was a pediatric uh, cardiologist, and who knew, who had worked with Richard, and I asked him, like, was he, known for anything in particular? Did he have a reputation of any kind? And he said, well, like, he had a reputation for having a good sense of humor. And at the time, that was a very jarring thing to hear because I had never heard this about him before, and everything that I had learned up till that point didn't suggest that at all. But then, I realized that everyone is like a different person to everybody. You don't present one side of yourself to every person you meet, and maybe someone comes away thinking that you're squeamish on blood, and other people don't. And ultimately, those sorts of impressions are just, you know, they're not definitive. They're contextually true.
Absolutely. I mean, but the thing that seemed to come up a lot, which isn't really subjective, is how he just seemed to be OCD about his space and very tidy and to an extreme. Which,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely the case, and I having seen the photos of his apartment, of his house, yeah, he was exceedingly neat. I mean, to the point where you could see the grooves of the vacuum in the carpet, and all the pictures and movie posters on the wall, were sort of perfectly aligned, and you know, he definitely had a very orderly way about him.
yeah. So I want to go back to the topic of gay panic. Do you think that there's a difference between gay panic and sort of like internalized homophobia? So the difference being like when I think of gay panic, I think of quote unquote straight men fearing being, hit on by gay men versus someone like Richard Rogers, who was clearly gay and openly gay at some point in his life or most of his life, and still decided to target gay men. So is that gay panic or is that
No,
something else?
gay panic is a sort of subset of a justification defense. All gay panic really is. There is no such thing officially, I believe, as a gay panic defense. It is really just a form of justification where the defense says, you know, he did it he did it because of X, right? Um, he did it because he snapped because the man came on to him or whatever. Now, the gay panic defense is banned in, like, I don't know, several states, but it's still allowed in, I think, most of them. But
Wow.
yeah, it's really just it's just a type of defense.
Wow. That I was not aware that it was still allowed. That is
Yeah, I believe it's mostly still allowed. I mean,
mm,
it's not common anymore.
mhm,
In part because prosecutors are better at um, dealing with it, and juries, you know, don't tend to be sympathetic to it anymore
mhm.
because it's such an ugly defense. But it's allowable most of the time.
Um, Speaking of violence, another thing I recall, and I do not remember the gentleman's name, but he was a man who was, I think he was murdered. Oh yeah, he was murdered, and he may have been a veteran, but he was considered quote unquote a respectable gay man. Um,
Yeah, this is, I believe, this is Jimmy Zappalardi.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I mean, this plays into, you know, how the press, then and now writes about victims. You know, if they're not, sort of quote unquote perfect, then the press tarnishes them. And, if a woman is considered promiscuous, then that's what the focus is going to be. And there's always going to be a hint that she deserved it and that, the dress she was wearing was too short or whatever. And yeah, I mean, and one of the poignant things for me is that like Jimmy Zappalardi's dad, you know, was forthright about it. He's like, he was one of the good ones.
wow.
But the thing is that like this was the early '90s and Staten Island, and you know what how he said it may be jarring to people now, but like he was just being blunt about a topic that people sort of still talk about, but just not in such forthright ways.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it, as you said, across the board when it comes to victims, what is a good victim? What is an ideal victim? Um, Class a lot has to do with it, and their status. If they light up a room,
I mean,
um,
and look, there's a long history of lawyers and movements finding the ideal plaintiff, right? I mean, like, and I don't mean this as like a one-to-one comparison, but like it was not an accident that Rosa Parks got on that bus. She was chosen, by the movement and the leaders. And so there's a long history of people paying attention to where the spotlight
hmm
gets aimed. And,
absolutely,
and obviously it's a very different situation, in the case of a murder, because you can't you can't control who the murder victim is, and but
mm,
obviously the press has a great deal of culpability in how they write about somebody and what they choose to focus on.
absolutely. So, were you a true crime fan, or should I say, true crime interested party before this book? Um,
I would say I had sort of fuzzier views about it. Um, I tended to find true crime interesting mostly as a way to talk about history. Um, I mean, to me, that was the great sort of usefulness of true crime. I mean, one of my favorite books is called "Man from the Train" by Bill and Rachel James, and
Sorry to interrupt you because this is
yeah,
totally inappropriate, but that is my favorite true crime book. Like, I'm to ask Danielle, I'm always touting that book. Am I not, Danielle? She's like, yeah. I wish you would shut up about that book.
well, it's an incredible book, and as you know, I mean, it is nominally about this axe murderer, uh, who basically killed people up and down the East Coast. But what the book really is about this, this turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, and about the changes in technology and law enforcement and how that intersects with the case. And I mean, and that's what takes it from a good book to a great book. In the same way that, Killers of the Flower Moon, on the one hand, yes, it's about the murder of, Osage Indians and the resulting investigation, but it's just as much about their life and about their society and how the American government tried to tear that away from them. And so, you know, that originally is why I was interested in true crime. But I would say the more as time went on and the more I worked on the book, um, I pretty much soured on the entire genre uh, just because so little of it seemed to be salvageable to me. I mean, it was so rare to find work that really did focus on the victims or really did focus on, the political and societal pressures that, are inevitably at play. And so much of it is awful.
Yes.
So
Um,
so so in my head, like I wasn't even writing a true crime book. I was writing a work of history.
yes. And that's what I loved about your book. All the detail was so great. And I'm a history nerd. And that's why I thought, the Man from the Train is definitely like, I can't say enough about it. He, where do I even begin? That's an amazing book. Have you heard of True Murder? It's
No.
a it used to be on the radio, but now it's like a podcast, and he basically focuses on true crime books, and
Hmm.
that's how I found out about the Man from the Train. But for me, if you want to understand the history of a city or a town or a state, going to an important crime is very very illustrative about a moment in history, and talking about salacious true crime. Sorry to throw shade at like Anne Rule, but yeah, and I'm sorry, I might get pushback, but Anne Rule, I think she's an example of that. Every book she wrote was basically about the same white woman, and everything is very romantic and salacious and very lifetimey,
Yeah, I mean, where I mean, I think to some degree that's true with her. I mean, where I will definitely give her a great deal of credit, and I think she was probably alone in doing it when she was doing it, is oftentimes she was very good about sketching the lives of the victims. Um, but it is true that, like most of the people that followed her, uh, it tended to be, pretty heteronormative white, you know, point of view. Uh, but she certainly had a lot of company.
Absolutely. I think I had actually heard, and maybe this is just some weird true crime myth, but apparently some one of her victims actually said, "If I ever die, I want Anne Rule to write the book about my life,"
I
and she
mean,
did.
she had such a high profile that I believe it.
For this book, did you visit a lot of piano bars and things of that nature? And what would you say? I guess if it didn't appear in the book, what are your thoughts on them and how they were able to bring people together? And I like the fact that it was like a community that wants to decompress, right? And deal with and just have a community and just being terrorized. It's just that's it for me. And when we were reading this book, we were still like during the pandemic, and I'm thinking all of these little nooks and crannies of gay history in New York. I'm sure the pandemic did not help with those things being
No, I mean, and gay bars in general were not in great shape. Um, the townhouse is still open. Um, I visited the townhouse a lot and talked to the piano player there. I went to some of the other bars in the city, like Julius, um, and places like that. But I didn't visit a lot, in part because they were no longer there. I mean, the Five Oaks, which I wrote about quite a bit, has been gone for decades. The Blue Parrot in Philadelphia was only open for like 3 or 4 years. So a lot of this is just recreation through press accounts, court transcripts, and interviews with people who went there or worked there. So yeah, to some degree, visiting places only took me so far. Um, and the same is true for like, there's a section on gay bars in Youngstown, Ohio in the
Yeah,
50s. And like, if you visit that section of Youngstown, which I did, it's just like grass, or there's like a highway running through it. I mean, there's nothing to see.
I can imagine. It's Ohio after all. No shade to anyone from Ohio. I'm sorry. Um, so I would be remiss if I don't bring up everybody's favorite mayor, who just, the gift that keeps giving,
Yeah.
Giuliani. Please
Mm.
explain how Giuliani, is related to how they messed up the sting operation, because wow.
Yeah, I mean, this was interesting. Because it was not when, at the time that I started the book, there had been like a forensic files segment. I think there had maybe been something on like ID discovery. And, and I'd read it. I thought I'd read most of the press accounts, and like, not at no point did any of the press accounts, mention this aspect of the case. And I had been interviewing the detectives for some time, and then one of the guys from New Jersey said, by the way, has like anyone talked to you about the Giuliani thing? And I said, no. And he said, well, and he, tells me part of the story. He's like, look, we had planned this surveillance, and then, Giuliani's mom was at Mount Sinai, so, the NYPD short circuited the surveillance and blew the end of the case. And so after I got off the phone with him, I called all the other detectives and said, so, you guys going to tell me about the Giuliani thing? And they, they're still angry after all these years. And so they all immediately just vented. And, you know, a year or so later, when I was working on the chapter about it, I both texted a bit with Rudy Giuliani, and then, got his buddy Bernard Kerik on the phone, because Bernard Kerik was the one who basically everybody pointed the finger at as having made the decision to screw up the case, and played phone tag with him until I, had kind of cornered him on the phone and got him to talk to me about it. But the long story short is that, they had planned the surveillance that they felt would have given the more information about Rogers, and because Bernard Kerik was trying to curry favor with Giuliani, he scooped Richard up and took him out of Mount Sinai, and uh, you know prematurely arrested him.
Wow. Yeah, I know you mentioned in the book how some of the detectives were basically saying, it doesn't matter if the victim is gay or not. We just want to catch a killer. Like it's like a competition. Like it really does gnaw at some of them to let someone get away with murder, even if it's, against a population that is marginalized. Do you
Yeah,
think that?
I,
Yeah.
I mean, and these guys, I don't think, I would never say that these guys are particularly enlightened, and I don't think they would say that either. I mean, they were always very clear with me about how little they knew about, gay bars and clubs and gay life at the time. This was like a whole new world for most of them. And I'm sure that for some of them, they sort of felt like it was just another case, and they wanted to solve it. And I'm sure for others, probably to some degree, they're overstating it now because you know it's a different time, and they know that. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it's probably a mix for them. But I mean, I do know that one of my assumptions when I went into this is that it hadn't been solved for as long as it, hadn't been solved, simply because they didn't actually work the case and didn't do the work. But that turned out to not actually be true.
So, anyone from the audience have any questions? Feel free to raise your hand. Um, I guess my other question would be, do you think you would have written a book on true crime if it wasn't for this case? Has any other case ever crossed your mind as needing to be written about?
Um, well, before this one, no, I wasn't looking for a true crime case. I wasn't looking for any crime at all. Um, and more or less had stopped looking for a book idea. Um, my goal then as now was really just to focus on the people involved. And if that meant, a true crime case, then fine. And if it doesn't, then it doesn't. But, one of the reasons that a case like this is attractive to a journalist, it's not so well, at least as what how I think about it. It's about the material that you have to work with, and when you're dealing with a case that's gone to trial uh, and results in a conviction, then you have a court transcript. You have a ready-made narrative, or at least something to work off of. It's much, much harder to write about an unsolved case,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
or to write about a case where it goes to trial and it ends up in an acquittal because,
Mhm.
and this varies by state, but like in New York, the court transcript is immediately sealed. So, you know, you don't always know what's happened. You're sort of at the mercy of the contemporaneous press coverage. And I was very lucky that first I you know drained my bank account paying a court stenographer to send me, a retired court stenographer, to send me chunks of the transcript, which was like, I don't know, $2 a page or something. It was ridiculous. And like I couldn't afford the whole thing. But then finally, when I interviewed the prosecutor in the case, he had like PDFs of the whole trial, including unredacted voir dire, which is when they interview jurors.
Mhm.
So I actually had the names of the jurors, which you're not supposed to have, and
Wow.
that's how I found one of them and got her to talk to me. But it saved me a lot of money, and it allowed me to write about the events. It was much easier because then I could just search a PDF and not these unwieldy bound volumes, which is what you get if you actually go through the courts.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned solving an unsolved crime, or writing about an unsolved crime. That's why the man from the train is so fascinating, because he's basically trying to solve this crime that, a series of crimes, and connect them. So, but yeah, absolutely. Um,
I have a quick question. Me and Elon, we talked a little bit earlier today, and I tried not to ask any of my questions because I wanted to save them for here and make sure you got all the questions in. But what were you most outraged about during doing the research for this book?
I mean, I don't know. It's like hard to say because everything about it is outrageous. Because, one of the things I used to tell people when they would ask me what the book is about, and I would say honestly that the serial killing aspect is like sort of the least of it. Because even if you strip that out, it's still about the AIDS epidemic in New York in the early 90s, which is as horrible as it gets. Um, I guess I guess I was just mostly outraged at Fred Spencer's, you know, at Richard being acquitted in the Fred Spencer murder. And
Hmm.
it's not so much that I think the evidence against him was, very strong, which I do think it was. And it's not that I'm surprised because it's Maine in the early, you know, 70s, and it's not Portland. It's, as someone in the town said to me when I was there, this is the real Maine. And but it was really just the thought that, like, history would have been different if he'd been convicted, and a lot of lives would have been saved. And so, that was upsetting. But, like, everything about the book is upsetting. I suspect it's one of the bleakest works of true crime people will read.
Yeah, and it was very graphic, and I don't know if this was your quote or someone else at towards the end of the audio where it says it's easier to get away with murder than anyone thinks, and I
Yeah,
found that
I said that.
I thought it was you.
I said that, and I firmly believe this. Like, so many, there are a lot of things that have to go right for a crime to be solved. I mean, for murders to be solved, and I mean, clearance rates are terrible to the extent that they're even reliable. And one of the quotes that I decided not to put in the book, but which I think about a lot, is a detective said to me, like, if you're going to be a serial killer, kill somebody in New York City. He's like, if you kill someone out in the sticks, then every detective for miles is going to treat it with like it was the Lindbergh baby. But if you kill, if you're a serial killer in New York, people are going to work it for like a week and then they're going to move on because they're going to have to do something else. And you know, I I think there's a lot of truth to that. But yeah, I mean, just in general, like, if they don't have the forensics, you know, and they don't have the forensics quickly, you're going to get away with it. And of course, it's like even worse when you're dealing with cases of sexual assault. You know, I mean, police work in general is pretty horrendous.
And also choosing the victim as well helps if you choose the right victim. So choosing someone
Right.
who doesn't lie to a room helps get away with murder.
Yeah. I mean, and look, like, one of the things that pisses me off a lot is when people focus on, you know, sort of profiling victims and, what did all these have in common? And people think about, like, Ted Bundy's kind of an anomaly where, like, he liked blonde women, basically, uh, if memory serves. Well,
Brunette.
l- or
Brunette.
okay, brunettes. I knew it was something, but, like, it's very, very rarely that simple. Years ago, I wrote a story. I guess it was probably the first story or comprehensive story about a serial killer in San Francisco called The Doodler. And I spent time with the cold case detective out in San Francisco, and I asked him, like, what all the, victims had in common. And he said to me, I know what you're asking, and it's not that. He's like, what do you think they had in common? And I said, well, they were gay and they went to bars. And he's like, that's right. That's what they had in common. And he's like, people think it's that it's more complicated than that. And it's just not. And in the case of, Last Call, um, what these men had in common is that they went to bars and they drank too much. And so they were extremely vulnerable. And, you know, victims of serial killers, no matter who they are, whether they're men, women, um, old, young, like, it's all about vulnerability. And that's the commonality. And to some degree, like,
The rest is noise, you know? People pay too much attention to it. Serial killers attack the vulnerable. I cannot tell you, but in part because it's never a good idea to mention this stuff until there's any kind of deal, but also it's still the early stages, so I have no idea. Some stuff going on in like the next year, but I can't talk about it. I will say, if you want to do one of these events with Rachel McCarthy James, co-author of Man from the Train, she's a pal of
Yes.
mine, and
Yes.
so I'm happy to put in a good word.
Oh my, yes. Did you hear that? Please make
I
that happen.
did.
Because you understand, like I'm gonna leave it alone. Everybody knows that's like my favorite book. Please, that would be great. The two of you, me, this club, yes.
Yeah, in fact, I did an event with her and Bill with the Raven Bookstore in Kansas, and that was a lot of fun because I grew up reading his work, and so that was a real kick. But yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. Buy the book. That's about all I've got to say.
Definitely. Thank you, and everyone who joined us. Stayed for the whole thing. You're the real MVP. If you haven't read the book, what are you waiting for? Buy the book.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right, take care.
Bye.